Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you, Glenn, for that lovely welcome. It reminds me of some of the things that are so long ago now that I can't remember actually doing them. But this is an archaeological talk, so it's about the physical remains that get left behind. What we also have in the Pacific and in New Zealand is a lot of traditional knowledge about gardening, about how to do things, deep knowledge about how things were adapted and modified in the past. And some of that's actually happening in the Whangārei area. So one of the little aside stories, which I might have mentioned last time, was that the kumara that you purchase in the shops today is actually a hybridized version of an American Hawaiian thing, so it's quite large and red. And it's very different from the traditional kumaras that were here at the time when Cook and Marion Dufresne arrived in the late 1700s. And due to a blight that went through in the 1940s, so anyway, there's this story that the traditional kumara basically nearly died out in New Zealand following a blight that came through. But the then Department of Science and Industrial Research, the old DSIR, had a plant scientist by the name of Doug Yen from Japan. And of course in Japan they have kumara and all these other things. And Doug Yen had started to collect some kumara from little walled gardens in various parts of Northland or Auckland. And he was trying to sort of save the species. A new director turned up at DSIR and said, get rid of all of that. Doug Yen basically quit. And he took the plants and went back to Tokyo University. And following his departure, essentially the kumara died out in New Zealand. But in 1996, there was a hikoi from the University of Tokyo bringing them back to New Zealand. And they're growing in various places around the country, including up at Onarahi, next to the airport. And so we've learned some interesting things about them, which we can talk about later, but they're drought tolerant. They can get a lot of their moisture from fogs and from dew, which makes them a really interesting plant. And they don't rip the soil like many plants do, like white potato does. So that's an intro to the kumara, which became hugely important in New Zealand when it wasn't so much so back in the Pacific. Okay. So, captive audience, Anthropology 101, where does it begin? So what you have here is Aotearoa, New Zealand was the last bus stop of humanity walking out of Africa. And it's a very obvious reason why. You can see with these numbers relate to thousands of years ago. And so, you know, looking at anatomically modern humans, we know they were here around 200,000 years ago. They walked out into the rest of these places here. They got across into North America somewhere around about 25,000 years ago, and that's a gap because you've got to get across a water gap. We know that they got across from island Southeast Asia into Australia 65,000 years ago. And while that looks quite a difficult thing, during the ice ages, essentially that became solid land, except for this little line there called Wallacea, which is a deep trench, and that never dried out. So people had to basically get across about 100 kilometers island hopping to get from Southeast Asia to Australia with a viable population and all the things you needed. And we've got burials at Lake Mungo down in Victoria from 40,000 years ago. So we know they were here before 40,000 years ago. So, but these water gaps here, and particularly out into the Pacific, are real barriers to humanity, and they had to do certain things to get there. So to get to Aotearoa, that was only about 1,000 years ago, because they had to get through the Pacific. If you've ever looked at your Google Earth map and looked for the sort of Cook Society's Marquesas, you can't see them. It's just blue, because they're so small. So the movement out of here, we can see the tracking from the genetics, from the languages, and from cultural models that people came through here. They developed maritime technologies, and then they moved out into the Western Pacific, which is Samoa, Tonga, Fiji, New Hebrides, or New Caledonia, and then out to the Eastern Pacific, to this zone here, which is the Cooks, Societies, Marquesas, Tuamotus, which is what we call the Eastern Pacific, and what Māori refer to as Hawaiki, where we came from. And from there, they exploded out. They went 2,500 kilometres down to Aotearoa. They went 3,000 kilometres out to Rapa Nui, Easter Island, and 4,000 kilometres up to Hawaii. And they didn't just stop there because the Polynesian Triangle said that's as far as they have to go. Bill talks about, sailing along and suddenly you reach the line of the Polynesian Triangle. Oh, sorry, you can't go any further. I mean, that's the Polynesian Triangle, They did get to North and South America because we have the Kuma that was brought back from there. But the difference there is it's full of people. And with the best will in the world, a load of waka turning up on the Chilean shore, as the Chilean ambassador said to Bill 20 years ago. We have traditions about these people coming over the sea, being met by 1 million Chileans going, "G'day," even with a really friendly greeting, you're still a third-class citizen in a country that's full of people. And so the model of settling the Pacific, which works so well for Polynesians, had to change. Now, plants. You have to understand that plants are the foundation of all complex societies. If you don't, even hunter-gatherer societies make use of plants, but to domesticate plants is important. And so you get these different centres of domestication. They occurred roughly about the same time, give or take 10,000 years ago, in different parts of the world, including out here in Papua New Guinea. And don't forget, this area here of Papua New Guinea and Australia, which was all sort of one continent at a time, was settled 65,000 years ago. And about 10,000 years ago, they started to domesticate various plants. And these are the ones that are relevant to Aotearoa, New Zealand, because it's plants from here and here, and a little bit from South America, that end up down here. And they came on these boats. These are double-hulled waka. They're very efficient. They work fast, like most catamarans do. Cook talked about how they'd sail at about 15 knots. Mind you, he's in a converted coal barge, so it's designed to carry bulk, not speed. So the Endeavour was a very good exploring ship, but not a racehorse. Okay. So here we have a picture of this our sort of Hawaiki. So here's the Bismarcks and the Solomons, where 30,000 years ago there was lots of people, lots with boats, and one particular group that we don't know their name, but we call them the Lapita people, after their distinctive dentate pottery, and it was finally identified on a little village in New Caledonia called Lapita. So people went, as archaeologists do, "Eureka! We've discovered a new pottery sequence. Yay, we can now track people." And so we named it after that. And it's found throughout here. This pottery is found all the way through here. And so it's known as the Western Pacific, and that happened about 12 to 1,500 years, about 2,200 years ago. And they got that far. And then there was a bit of a hiatus for about 1,000 years, and then they did another big push. Now, to get from here to here required going across a 150-kilometre water gap and having boats and navigation, which allows you to do that securely. Okay? I don't know if any of you guys are sailors at all, but I've sailed out to Great Barrier Island, which is only 50 miles, 50 kilometres away. It's a long way. It goes, it's about, sailing 150 k's. It's like driving from Kerikeri to Auckland. It's like, do it in 4 hours. Yeah, try putting it in a boat with X hundred people and all the food supplies and stuff like that. So this move out to here occurred about 1,000 years later, and all of this area here of tiny islands filled up with what we call the Polynesian people, and within a very short space of time, they did the big push to Aotearoa, Easter Island, Hawaii, and of course South America, because it was a very successful colonization policy, filling up the empty world. So there's your dates at the bottom. Sorry, not working. There we go. Okay. So here's a sort of the different types of plants. You'll be tested afterwards, so you better pay attention. This is Anthropology 101. So in Mesoamerica, you have corns and squash and tomatoes, manioc, sweet potato. There's a lot of other ones as well, the capsicums and stuff like that. The Near East are the ones people most are familiar with, the wheat, barley, oats, lentils, grapes, olives, and of course the domesticated animals. And then Southeast Asia, you've got millet and rice, breadfruit, all these tree crops, which is quite important, bananas, coconut, which is really important, yams and taro, and then there's pigs and the chicken. And it's those ones that got into the Pacific. And as you can see, all of these ones come from, ultimately originate here, but the sweet potato comes from Mesoamerica. So when archaeologists discover something like kumara as a sweet potato in New Zealand, or even back in the Hawaii, dated to 1200 AD, which is 100 years before the settlement of New Zealand, then we know that you have to explain it. It's before the Portuguese, it's before the Spanish. Your only options are South Americans bringing it in, or Polynesians going to get it. And one of the things I showed you with the Polynesian model is they had a progression of learning from islands in the Bismarcks, where you could see the island you're going to a next step where they're over the horizon, to the next step where they're further over the horizon, and then to the point where you can develop these long distance voyaging. The South Americans had none of that. They had 1,000 miles to get to Easter Island, which is a bit of a speck in the water, and then another 1,000 miles to get into the Pacific. So they didn't have the boating technology at the time, even though Thor Heyerdahl thought that they did. So these are the crops. We're sort of starting to focus down now. Yams, sweet potato and taro. All three were here and were reported by Cook and Sir Joseph Banks and various others when he arrived. Bananas and breadfruits and coconut didn't make it here, but they were back in the homeland. So people understood how to grow tree crops. So, what's the old expression? He toa tawa, mate tawa, he toa piki pari, mate pari, he toa naki kai, ma te huhu tena. Nearly got that right. But the warrior dies in war, the climber after the bird dies by falling, the husbandman dies of old age. And that's the thing about horticulture. It allows you to have larger populations. So Cook talks about visiting all the places, including Northland, and they talk about how they cleared the land and how they were growing basically kumara. They were also growing yams. Yams were pretty borderline in New Zealand. Cook and Banks talk about yams and then they disappear because they were pretty much thrown away because of the other crops that were coming in. But they had them before, they worked at them before because they didn't have any alternatives. So there you go. A is your taro, B is your kumara, and C is your yams. And the taro is the #1 crop in the Pacific. Glenn talked about the work I was doing on Whangārei and the Southern Cooks. They have irrigated taro systems like rice paddies where the water reticulates through, and the productivity is huge, intensification of plants. They do have kumara there. So the kumara made its way back to the Cook Islands. But they don't eat it. They just feed it to the pigs because it makes them taste nice. They eat taro. And the taro that used to come to New Zealand, especially for the Cook Island communities that were based in Auckland, Wellington and Dunedin, apparently the ship would come in with a load from either Whangārei or Nauru, which is one of the other good places for, or Niue, I forget which one, of great taro. And the Cook Islanders would descend upon the ship and then it would get to Wellington and then they'd descend upon the ship, and the poor guys down in Dunedin had what dregs were left. Now, so archaeology is a fact-based science. So here's some lovely pictures to show you. So here is a picture of New Zealand. The little dots are essentially showing you the archaeological sites that have been recorded. And there is a dominance, especially when you look at the PAR sites in the north. And it correlates to the horticultural zone where you can grow particularly kumara. So in these kumara areas, it's not just a hard line, essentially coastal zones, and then down in the top of the South Island, you can see we can still grow around there. It's the reliability of growing. So what happened was that they arrived in New Zealand. The taro can only really grow in the far north on wetland systems and dryland systems, And they took the kumara, which had a short growing season of 5 months, and it became the dominant crop. But if you go back to Māngāia, they leave them growing in the ground all year round. But in New Zealand, we have something called climate, which goes from subtropical at best to subarctic at worst. And you have to store your kumara over winter, both to eat and for your seed crop. And so that's why we have kumara pits, hundreds and thousands of kumara pits scattered around Northland. And for archaeologists, these kumara pits are really important because they tell us people were growing food and storing it. If we had things like wheat or barley, you could find the grains because they get preserved in the ground. But they don't. You have kumara, which is a tuber, and as you all know, it sits under the sink in a brown paper bag, and then if you don't eat it quick enough, it turns to mush and disappears. So there's no seeds. Oh, well, what about pollen? Well, they harvest the kumara before the flowers come, so there's no pollen. So we're looking at indirect evidence of where the kumaras were grown and traditional knowledge and all that sort of stuff. So these are the types of gardening systems that we have. These things are called slope trenches. They're basically what you see on Limestone Island, these long lines running down the slope. We call them slope trenches. Their function is a little bit unclear. On Limestone Island, what they're doing is they're actually piling up the very thin soil between the trenches to create a gardening zone. And then the trenches do take excess water away. And the limestone grounds are really very good for growing kumara. The other one are stone structures. Now we have a lot of those up north here. If you go up north to Pakaraka, where those lovely volcanoes are, going through to Ohaiwai, there's the volcanic fields. So there's ground littered with volcanic rock, and people have moved this rock around to make stone mounds and stone rows, and basically create a gardening system. You have them in Whangārei, but they were converted to European farms very early on. So 3 Mile Bush Road, out Maunu Way, we've still got the parasites, you've still got the kumara pits on the hills, but all those stone walls that you see, they're basically reused the stone to make European stone wool farms. Were the Māori gardens, stone field gardens there? Probably, but they would have gone probably in the 1870s before anybody took any photographs. There may be some photographs in the Te Wake collection or something like that, but we haven't found them yet. So, and then you get your modified soils. That's where you actually modify the ground to create a soil that's quite useful. And up the north here, we have them on Moturua Island, where I've done some work, and we think it's associated with the early historic provisioning trade for the whaling and sealing fleets. Because you can imagine all the wooden ships coming in, all the sealers and whalers, and they want preserved food. And they don't have tinning, and they don't have the really drying, they have salting. So you take your pork, so the pigs, which were introduced in the late 1700s, and you salt your pork, and the potatoes, the white potato, is grown, and it hangs on nets under the decks of ships, which are notoriously moist. And that provides you with the carbs and the proteins that you need. And so the white potato became a trade which paralleled the continuing growth of kumara, dominating, for local consumption. And these all leave a sort of an archaeological record, and particularly stone structures. And so, you know, you've got them on Great Barrier and Tauranga Island, out at Whangārei Heads, there's a little bit out there. Poor Knights have a lot, and I'll talk about those. Waipua has amazing stone gardening systems, which are basically controlling excess water. So they move water away. You don't want the water to power through your gardens and take all your soil away. Up on the Three Kings Islands, they have too little water, so they use stone features to try and catch the water, to keep it in the soil. So this is one of the ways to grow kumara. You make a little mound, and you have a sort of a little bowl underneath of material, rocks and stuff from the beach, or in the Waikato, it's sort of volcanic tuff that you use, and you grow them in these little mounds. And then you store them in your kumara pits. So what we see on the ground are these little holes in the ground, rectangular holes. Huh? And here's an example, a reconstruction with a cutaway bit. So it's a rectangular hole, that's all you see, but it had a structure over the top. Inside there would have been racks with sand or bracken. So you lay the kumara on it and it sucks the moisture away. Outside you have a drain to stop water coming down the hill going into it. Inside you have a drain to take the water out. Now, Whangārei has hundreds and hundreds of these. And some of them are very, very big. You know, your normal size kumara pits probably, if this wall was here, you know, you go from here to about here, be about that big. Some of them are a bit bigger. Up on Parihaka, you've got some that are 10 metres long, 6 metres wide, 2 metres deep. These are clearly serious concepts, often involving quite complex society who has control over stuff, got a big tangi coming up, the chief controls that kumara pit, so that's the food for that event. And that's exactly the model you get in Māori to this day. And what we get left behind when you look down is a rectangle, and sometimes you'll see post holes to support the roof, and sometimes you'll see little drains around it. And we've found those many, many, many times. So the rua kumara, it's a new invention, it's a New Zealand invention, and they didn't have 1,000 years to do it. They had a very short space of time. So let's have a look at some gardening systems. All of these little red things are evidence of gardening in the north. And as you see, quite a lot around here in Whangārei, including especially in the Portland area. We don't know too much about the Portland limestone soils, except the preponderance of past sites is a pretty good clue that it was pretty important. But Whangārei itself, and I lived here for 15 years, it grows anything. You know, slugs, snails, mold, plants just go nuts. You can get 2 crops of kumara out of the valley when you can only get 1 outside. It's a microclimate, it's perfect. And so like all of the good gardening zones, it was fought over endlessly. And I'm just going to do a shout out to Andy Brown, who's the archaeologist behind you. Andy's been doing some really interesting work in the sort of the Regent area of Whangārei, looking at remnant bits and pieces of gardens. And he's done an elevation model in the valley, just looking at the little high points, just using technology, which I'm not very good at. And he's shown that where we actually have recorded some stuff around the houses, because it's all underneath the houses now, right? That's where you start finding the site. So there's some interesting work going on in Whangārei. So good one, Andy, and thank you so much for sending me that plan through. I was going to put it in here, but I forgot. So sorry. So, because it's all about me, you see. So there's a lot of important stuff, and Whangārei is a really, really important place. So I'm going to first take you up to Whakangi. It's near Monganui in the far north. And here's Sandra Heihei, who lives over there, with some remnant taro, just growing wild. And here we're down in Taimaru Bay, and you can see all the past sites on the hills around about 1900. And there's the church, which has now gone to Waitaruke in the Whangaroa. And there you can see those kumara growing just like we had on that historic photograph. So what about the Poor Knights? This is where I did my doctoral research back in the day. And you get this range of stone structures that are built by people, and it relates to gardening. But it's complex. Like all market gardeners, you don't have just one crop. Farmers have one crop. Market gardeners and horticulturalists have multiple crops. And you do that partly because your market is multiple, but also it's a good safety system. You don't want to do all at once. So in these stone fields, the good volcanic silty soils, well drained, littered with rock, you can just plant if you want. And in the very early days, when the waka had just arrived in New Zealand and the communities were widely spaced and small in number, they probably just did that. They probably just had some good soil, they planted, they harvested, so they burnt it, planted, harvested, 3 days. But as population grows, you want to increase your productivity. You don't want to get to intensification like in Māori, because that's very expensive in terms of manpower, and it actually takes a lot of the mana away from the people on the bottom, and people don't like that. So you do what you have. So you made stone heaps, bordered stone heaps, stone mounds with soil on the inside, stone rows, and a variety of structures and freestanding walls. So here on the Poor Knights, you can see this. This is one of these long stone rows. Literally nobody has been to this island apart from a few dock rangers since 1823. And these relate to what people were doing at that particular point in time. And so they were remarkably well preserved. This image here is looking down on this bit, and you can see the construction. Big rocks on the outside, little rocks in the middle, And as you can see, it's cleared of rock. So you can grow between the rows. You might put a fence on the road to help with the wind and catching the fogs and stuff, and we talked about that. And so this is what we ended up with on this island, which, as you can see, is about 3 to 4 kilometers long. We ended up with horticultural zones, which are the green, and they were there from at least 1300 AD. We'd reconstructed the vegetation from pollen cores, and they're long-term living. But the brown areas are the occupation zones. The silver areas are your specialist work floors making stone tools, and your red are your tapu areas where people were buried. And the living on these occurred probably after Cook. So in other words, they gardened there since 1300 AD all the way through, but Ngāti Wai in the mid to 1700s were under a lot of pressure from Ngāpuhi, and they had relatives out on Aotearoa Great Barrier, and they had relatives, and they moved out to hen and chickens, they moved out to the poor knights, things like that. And so this was one of those movements. So you got to teased out a mixture of things. Let's have a look at this particular garden here. Now, if I take all the bits off, deconstructed it, as they say in modern parlance, there is 4 artifacts. In other words, we don't find artifacts in the gardens. Makes sense. Most of the artifacts are in the villages, because that's where you process stuff. And that's consistent throughout the island. Now, these are the stone rows. So we mapped all of these stone rows, and you can start to see that there's a sort of a pattern of gaps. Okay. This stone row here was in the process of being built when the island was abandoned. Only 5 meters of it had been built. They had cleared all of this, but they literally stopped, and this is all full of loose rock. These are stone mounds, which you can garden on. It's also land clearance, but you can garden on them. And the Chinese market gardeners in South Auckland talk about mound gardening as being 2 to 4 times more productive than flatland gardening. There's been some science done where they heat up quicker, they hold their heat longer, so you can do better things. Farmers and horticulturists get what I'm talking about. It's so easy when I gave a talk to the New Zealand Tree Croppers Association. They're going, oh, yeah, I get that. You know, it's like everyone else is like, the only time I actually see a garden is on television. And then we get these things, which are basically slope stone facings on mounds. And what that does, when you've got a slope like this, you put a little wall up, and it means that the soil behind is at a slightly lesser slope, better retention of water. Because the poor nights, the water just falls through the ground. So you need to retain the water. And then you get the loose rock that's still around. And then you get these green terraces, which we think are horticultural terraces. Now, we may be wrong, but these we think are where they were growing stuff. And then you get the brown terraces where they were living, and there's houses and stuff like that in the gardens. And then you get a weird lot of other stuff which we don't quite understand, but it's all about functionality. So let's have a look at Poirua. Now, if you've ever driven up north, we have lots of old ancient volcanics up north, the little volcanoes. Auckland has them, and from the early 1900s, the Auckland Council protected them for visual reasons. But all the gardens that are associated with each of those volcanoes is covered in houses in Auckland. And if you go to Pukitono, you know where the quarry is, on the way over to Paihia, you'll see there's all these stone mounds on the other side of the road, so that's all intact. But Poirua is the largest one. The Williams family got hold of that land quite early on, and they never ploughed it. And one of the reasons why they never ploughed it was because after kumara grows and the land has to be left fallow, the bracken fern, the native New Zealand bracken fern, comes in. And it's got horizontal rhizomes like ginger. You literally can't plough it with a horse-drawn plough. So they didn't. They just ran stock. And so what we ended up with was this. Now this is an overlay of an archaeological drawing of the terraces and pa defences on top of the volcanic cone. Okay? Coming down here, and then you've got all of the gardens all the way around it. Now let's have a look at this little area here, which is like 1/16 of what's going on. And that's what's in that little area there. These are the slopes. These are contour lines dropping down. These are stone mounds. And in that one section there's 2,000 stone mounds. These are drain lines. So let's have a look at that. And that's what it looks like. So it's actually an internationally significant archaeological landscape, which is why it's in the FNDC's protected areas thing. And so lovely little microclimate. You can see the stone mounds, and the productivity was huge. These volcanoes produced this little pockets of volcanics in a sea of clay. And it forced people to live in these zones. And so probably more intensification going on these volcanics than you will find anywhere else. So what about wetland gardening systems? Now, they are preponderantly in the north where you can grow taro. Doesn't mean they just use them for taro. You can mound up soil in a wetland to make a sort of a bed and grant your kuma on the top of that. As long as it doesn't get its feet wet, it's happy. And that's the sort of taro system that you get. This is from Rarotonga, and it's like rice paddies, where you get water reticulating in and moving through, and you get very high productivity. And so that's what you sort of have as the picture in your mind when you talk about the garden system. So this is up near Awanui, where the swamp kauri is found and stuff like that. And what you're seeing is a series of drains. So this is slightly higher land here, and the drains are coming down. This is the lower land, and you can see the river here. And these have turned them into a grid that they were gardening. Now, I was talking to Glenn before we came here. We're not sure if this is a reticulated gardening irrigated system or whether it's just a flood control, because up north, the problem is not like you get in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia, you've got the monsoonal rains, and you rely on those to feed into your rice paddy systems. So they deal with not enough water and too much water. But up north here, it's mostly too much water. And so these could just be flood control systems. If you don't need to build something bigger, any farmer will tell you, I'm not going to spend the money on it if I don't need to do it. But there's some interesting work going on with Russell Gibb up at Mapua in the avocado area near Motutangi, near Hauhora, where there's a whole series of drains. And they're quite ancient, and they're quite useful systems. So you get multiple types of systems. This is a wetland system. This is just a reconstruction painting of Mangahawea on the Moturoa Island, where we've done a lot of work. The waka are coming ashore. That's where the village is. That's where the hangis are. This is the sort of garden zone at the back. So it's an idea of a reconstruction. And the thing about archaeology, sometimes it's a little bit hard to sort of get your mind around it. You've got to have a degree of interpretation. If you, for example, see a house, you know it's a house. If you see a ruin of a house, you know it's a ruin of a house. But most people need a little bit more to get their brains going. And back when I used to work with those two reprobates over there, the Department of Conservation, we used to go out to Motukauri Island in Parua Bay, and would take the school parties out and would have all the parent help for thinking they're having a boring time. And then would say to the kids, here's the map, go and find the tihi at the top of the platform. And they'd be off. And I'd say, here, the parents, go and you do it. And they're all scratching their heads and trying to work around. The kids are having a great time. So the point is you need a degree of interpretation. Now, what about tree crops? We don't have banana, though we're starting to get warm enough to do it. We don't have breadfruit, which is really important. But what we do have was a number of things. The paper mulberry. Now, in the Pacific, you see tapa cloth. Tapa cloth is made from the paper mulberry plant. Tapa cloth is hugely important. It's used in all sorts of ways, and it was here. Joseph Banks recorded it up in the Bay of Islands, both the paper mulberry plant and tapa cloth being made. And then you have the karaka tree, which is a native New Zealand tree, which also became a tree crop, which people have only recently got their head around. So Aote, the paper mulberry, there it is growing in the Pacific. We know from museum relics that you get these weird pounders, which are square in section. Now, if you've ever seen a fernroot pounder, which is that native New Zealand bracken fern, which is also eaten, they're round in section. And you beat them on a stone, get all the good carbs out of them. But these are square in section, and they have these grooves. And that's what you'll find in the Pacific, and that's for making tapa cloth. So we have those, even though they don't have any plants left. So we know it was here. And that's the sort of tapa cloth thing that you can get. You know, they were hugely important culturally. So then you have karaka. Now, everyone knows about karaka trees, you know, the lovely berries that the kereru and the kukupā eat, and the fruit on them is quite edible. The nuts are edible, but you have to get the toxins out of them. You don't want to die of eating karaka nuts. And that's the distribution of karaka naturally in New Zealand. It's from Whangārei north. And occasionally you can still find a karaka tree that's been not domesticated, and the seeds are about this small. But what you generally see all through these distribution down here is seeds this big. And out on the Chathams, it got even bigger. So they were domesticating the karaka tree. And it's only recently that our colleague, Dr. Justin Maxwell, who did his work out there on the Chathams, the latest science is that the karaka nut is actually what they call a super nut. It's got all of the trace elements and stuff that you need to live. So if you have karaka nuts and a bit of fish, you'll be fine. And that's what kept the Chatham Islanders going for 400 years when they were domesticated. So there's the Chathams. There's what we used to think they were living on, which is, you know, occasional sea mammals coming ashore and dying. But the archaeologists didn't actually know that much about what you need to live back in the 80s when I was studying this. We can't live on meat. You'll die of protein poisoning. You've got to have carbs. You can't grow kumara out there. It's too wet, too cold. While there may be an occasional season when you can't do that. White potato, when it came in, was grown avidly. But we know that they were using shellfish because these are shellfish middens on those islands. And there's all the different types of environments there with broadleaf, and it's those broadleaf zones which are karaka trees. And they were grown, and they're still there to this day, and that's when you get the famous dendroglyphs carved into the trees. Now, for whatever cultural reasons those are there, it's all about control and management of a resource. And this is what we found in Māori and the Southern Cooks. You have you have your Joblo people, you have your Kaumatua, you have your sub-chiefs, and you have your high chiefs. And it's all about who has rights to use certain things. Everyone has a sort of your right to stand, but that reflects the value that was going on those trees. And what we find is that in New Zealand, you'll find them often associated with archaeological sites. So on the mainland of New Zealand, they're having karaka trees, they're next to the past sites, often in lovely little sheltered valleys and stuff like that, and they're making use of them, and we just go, oh, isn't that pretty? We didn't actually realize it. So one of the things archaeologists do over the years is try to not tell people how embarrassingly stupid we were when we were looking at them 10 years ago, but hey. So during my last talk, some people were very polite to me, but they said to Glenn afterwards, why can't you talk a bit more about Whangārei? Because, you know, it's the center of the universe, and I'd agree with that. So I thought, okay, and I've designed a self-directed field trip for you guys, and you can take one of these things with you. And there's Parihaka. You don't have to climb up, you can drive right up to the viewing platform, go and have a look out over the hidden city of Whangārei, because all the gardens are under houses. But down here is Tawa Tawhiti, and it's by chance, it's a remnant garden under beautiful native bush, including karaka. That's what the garden, that's the site of Parihaka. All this dark area, that's where all the features are. It's the longest archaeological site in the country, about 4 kilometres. And that's what it looks like when Glenys Nevin recorded it in the 1980s. Each of these little dark things is a kumara pit. So there's 88 of those, and some of them up here, like that one is the 10-metre long one. So you literally go from the car park, just walk along, and you'll see them on each side, okay, as you go. And due to the nature of the ground up there, it holds its shape. Unlike most places where things slump and fall down, some of those balks that are 3 metres tall are still vertical. But if you happen to walk off the track, don't do it in wet weather, because the clay has 0 coefficient of friction, and you'll be like walking on ice. So it's just one of the quid pro quos. But this down here is Tawa Tawhiti, and you can just park along the Hatia Drive. So as you know, when you come from the Regent down Hatia Drive, and you come down the hill and you see the river on your left, And on the right, there's the Colonial Hotel, something like that. Just park up, and this is what you'll see. So there we are down here. That's an enlargement, and you can see these ridges with kumara pits and terraces and defences and all sorts of stuff. And this is what you'll see. So here's Hatia Drive, coming down here. And this is the history of Whangārei in stone. Here you have Mayor's Landing, 1842, oldest European structure in Whangārei. It's built right on the tidal thing where the fresh and the seawater come together. And my boss Bill and I were down there mapping all of this because we thought this was an important place because they had all of these things. These are stone moles coming out, and people built boat sheds on them. And so those were late 1800s, early 1900s through to about 1940. They had all sorts of interesting stuff there, and there's really interesting stories about that. Then the bridge across to Onaraki, which is quite low, replaced a metal swing bridge that pivoted in the middle, which is very sexy and very exciting and broke down every day. So they replaced it with that, and because it's so low, the boats could no longer get up there, and this all became a remnant area that hasn't been touched. But what we can actually see when we get into here is that they've got garden mounds. Okay? But over here, you've got a coal chute. And that's a little thing stuck out into the side by the grass. And that's where coal came from Fow Valley on a horse-drawn railway down the road that was there, which is a little bit different than this. And it was put into barges and went to Auckland. So 1840s, 1860s, 1900s, you can still see the railway lines and stuff that they had for the little dollies to bring the boats up. But here, Māori gardens, lovely stone mounds, and one of those stone rows. So what I'm trying to show here, this is what archaeologists do with a two-dimensional map. We're trying to show 3 dimensions. So this road, as you know, is quite high and it drops down this way. So this is steep slope coming down. This is all the road formation line, like that as it comes down. But by chance, this bit of stone row has been saved. So there you actually have the history in stone. And these mounds, these boat moles here, were stone was taken from these stone mounds here. You can actually see how they do it. So Ihi was talking about the history of Whangārei in stone. It's called Tawa Tawhiti. It's a good place to catch fish. And you're allowed to walk there. It's just a bit of remnant ground. So just park up on the grass, have a look at those things and walk in here. And so what I've done is I've got a handout for you. You're welcome to take one. There's 50, so if you've got a couple, just take one each. So there's your parihaka. Just drive up to the top, to the car park, and have a walk. It's well signposted. Then drive down, go to Tawa Tawhiti, and you can go and have a look and see if you can find some of these features. Treat it like your parent help on a school party, because you may have to go there with your grandkids at some point in time. So that's basically what I wanted to talk about today. You live in a very important place. Whangārei is, if you look at the Glenys Nevin's reports about the archaeology, she went into the native land court records, and Whangārei was a focal point between Ngāti Whātua to the south and Ngāpuhi to the north, fought over time and time again. And all of the good gardens were done like that. So Auckland, for example, with its volcanoes and its gardens under houses now, Tamaki Makarau, Tamaki, the land of 1,000 lovers. Everybody wants a piece of it. And so parihaka, okay? People say, well, it's parahaki, isn't it? Well, if you go to the early land maps, it's parihaka. And parihaka refers to the haka that was held on there when a battle literally came to that mountain. Now, that's sort of, death and defying stuff. This is a battle that you live and die at. Most of the battles would have been down the harbour, all of your fighting paths and stuff. But this is right in your central area. So that's why it was called that. And names change. If you go back to the 1930s, Whangārei used to be called Whangarei. Don't think we use that anymore. But so that's the reason for the name. But English language people tend to use words in certain ways, as opposed to the French. When various French explorers came through, they used to complain bitterly about Captain Cook and his pronunciation of Maori words. So most people who live in this area will know about gardens. You can grow pretty much anything in Whangārei. My point is that gardens provide the economic foundation for societies. If you don't have good gardens, you don't have an ability to support lots of people. If your gardens can preserve the food, it means that your supply and demand of food that goes like this. If you can't preserve the food, then this is your population level. It's the bottom of the curve. But if you can preserve them in kumara pits, this is your population level. So this is 101 economics, supply and demand. So you live in an interesting area. We call Whangārei the hidden city. There's all sorts of stuff going on. We can still find bits and pieces of it. Andy found an early drain from the early historic periods, 1870s probably. But what that was doing was draining some of the streams that were in the area around the Regent, which had just normal streams, and then Māori modified those, and then they needed to be modified again so you can build houses on it. And that's the history of the European settlement of the town. So there's still stuff around. It's an interesting place. I've only really touched on the different plants. When white potato came in, for example, it radically changed the whole landscape of New Zealand. So I'll leave you with one thought. If we didn't have kumara arriving in New Zealand, if it hadn't been brought back from South America to the Hawaii 100 years before New Zealand was settled, we would have had taro, and most of the archaeological sites would have been Whangārei North. If when they brought the kumara back from South America, if they brought the white potato back, the archaeological distribution of sites in New Zealand would have been all over the country, because we know in the early 1800s when white potato came in, they were grown all the way around. So just by chance, you get an archaeological distribution that's based on certain physical factors that can't be fixed until something else arrives. But either way, you'd be living in the best place. Thank you very much. Kia pai. Yeah.
My sister Kathleen Shawcross did a lot of research.
Yes.
Probably encountered it.
Yes.
On the dietary habits of the pre-European Māori and as late as 1830. And she said that the kumara then was not the great monsters we get from the kaipara these days. People have conceptions that those kumara pits were bulging with these marvellous tubers that they grow. But they were about the size of your index finger, a bit longer in a good year, that one. And they were hard work. And as late as 1830, they were still far more dependent on the tubers of the fern root than they were on the kumara.
So Kathleen Shawcross is a really important figure in New Zealand archaeology, so reflected glory to you. There is a big debate about the role of kumara and the role of bracken fern. Bracken fern was a wonderful travel food. You could take it with you, you could dig it up wherever you went. And you can argue that kumara turns up in William Williams' Māori dictionary, all these different terms about growing it and propagating it and all this stuff. So it's clearly important. I let people fight it out, but essentially both were important. The bracken fern is carcinogenic, but you weren't going to live long enough to really have to worry about that. So, so the answer is yes. And one of the things that they noticed when the kumara came back from Tokyo University was that the university had cleaned out a whole lot of viruses inside them. And what that said to the geneticists was there had been a pinch point in terms of the amount of crops that initially came to Aotearoa, New Zealand. So we had a small number of kumara, and the 3 or 4 varieties that Doug Yen talked about, which are probably a subset of maybe 6 or 8, were all from that pinch point. And that's why there was a genetic bottleneck, and that's why they were susceptible to viruses, and that's probably why the blight took everything out. So.
Have you written a book on any of this, or do you have plans
to? So a lot of people who are better writers than me, including Kathleen Shawcross, have written about this. If you're looking at books in the Whangārei Library, there's the Janet Davidson's book, which is now nearly 40 years old, but still based on 100 excavations, and it summarises a lot of this, and that's called The Prehistory of New Zealand. Now, please don't take prehistory to mean before history. Its term means before written history, and we don't use that term anymore because people misinterpret us being rude. So, but it's here, it's in the collection, and there is also 1,000 Years of Gardening, which I think your sister was involved with the writing of that. That's a really good one. So those two books, Prehistory of New Zealand and 1,000 Years of Gardening. But there's been other things like back in the 1980s where you had Auckland covered in houses, but the pa were preserved. South Auckland had all the gardens preserved and all the volcanoes had been quarried away for roading. And in the 1980s, all of those were turning into factories. So there's a lot of archaeological work done by Sue Bulmer and various other colleagues of mine at the day. And they did some experiments on what did growing stuff on a stone mound do, and it was higher temperatures, all these sorts of things. So it actually worked quite well. So there's some science going on as well. So there is that stuff there. And we can sort of provide more information if you need it. But one of the things Bill told me just yesterday was that we're actually going to be putting together a whole lot of our displays for online education purposes. So we'll let Glenn know about that, and you might send out a point to everyone who signs up to these talks. So make sure you signed up and you'll get all the information. There you go.
You haven't mentioned the squash that were traditionally grown, hue and kamakamo. When did they arrive? Did they come pre-European?
So the bottle gourd, the te hue, is a really important crop. It's the most widely distributed crop in the world. So it came through Southeast Asia, but it also went into South America. So we don't know, and it was grown here and it's here. So those two lines came together in Aotearoa, but we're not quite sure if they came together at the time of Māori settlement. Yes, it's very important, and they used to grow those, especially on the mounds, because it is a creeper. You know, it does that. But so is kumara to an extent. So so it is very important. Joan Mingy did her MA thesis on te hue. It's in the Auckland University. She was my old boss, you guys will remember, and that's a really important bit of document that's sort of fallen out of usage. So give Auckland University a call and get hold of a copy of that. I think maybe, Glenn, you should get a copy of that for the Northland Reading Room. So it is important. We don't know too much about it. There is a really interesting question about this. All of those traditional kumaras in New Zealand have hybridized. So we can't tell you if it's South American or Southeast Asian. But places like the Poor Knights do have gourd seeds from 400 years ago. And from DNA testing, we might be able to work out if it was one or the other. And through the classic archaeological scientific method, if 400-year-old bottle gourd seeds from the Poor Knights turn out to be South American, then it's another crop that came from South America back into the Pacific along with the kumara. If it turns out to be Southeast Asian, because it's 400 years before Europeans arrived, it's going to be another Southeast Asian crop. But if it's hybridized 400 years ago, then both came. Can you see how this is the presence and absence of information allows you to come to control? I can't look at modern versions because they're hybridized. I don't know when they're hybridized. But if you find them in an archaeological deposit where it's dated, then you're at a period of time before Europeans arrived. And it has to be one or the other or the combination. Thank you for raising te hue. It's really important.
So you're saying you don't know which line it came from?
It may have come from both, or it came. It did arrive. It did arrive, yes. Cook and Banks talk about it. Well and truly documented. And the seeds survived, so one of the few plants with seeds.
It must be a pollen record.
Yes, but the seeds as well, in particular. If you let the gourd grow mature, the seeds form, and then you can turn it into a calabash. If you eat them, you eat them before the seeds form, so you don't find seeds. So when we find seeds, we know they're making things out of them, or creating a seed crop for the next crop. So thank you for that.
I'd like you to clarify for me a bit about, because I quite missed it, I couldn't quite hear properly, about the kumaras going off to Japan and the dates, because
So
they had never actually disappeared from New Zealand, they went so was it hybridized?
So I'm sure there are some still surviving somewhere in New Zealand. But what happened was there was a blight and most of them disappeared, and it's well documented in the 1940s. Some remnants that were still in Māori walled gardens in various rural areas were collected by Doug Yen, and sometime in the 1960s, this collection of kumara went to Tokyo, where they were looked after at the university. The story assumes that kumara in New Zealand basically continued to die out because you need a certain number of them to have things keep going and propagating on. And we had the introduced hybridized kumara that we have today arriving, and most people were choosing that. Because as the point was made, these were tiny little kumara. Some of them were white, some of them were black. Yeah, so that's what happened. That's not to say they completely died out. They may still be there, but there have been no records of it. And that's the thing that happens. You reach a certain minimal number and things just disappear, as happened with the yams.
That was the original ones that died out, not because I was growing kumara shoots
Yes.
in the early 70s. You know, I buy cases.
So,
Good, so.
yeah, but those hybridized kumaras arrived in New Zealand quite early. So, you know, it's maybe early 1900s when they started having those. If not early, I don't know the history of that. We can keep going if you want some more questions. So.
I just wanted to clarify that question this lady had about cucurbits. The term she mentioned was kamo, and you spoke about hui, gourds, calabashes. So just to answer that question about kamo.
So there's various stories about Māori potatoes. The problem is we think they arrived very early in the historic period. So what you find from the late 1700s when Governor King was introducing a whole lot of plants into New Zealand to trying to develop a provisioning trade, we think plants came in. We may be wrong, okay? We may be wrong, but if we are wrong, there doesn't seem to be any traditional evidence of them growing in the past. We can't find it archaeologically. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, but our current hypothesis is that that plant is an early historic arrival. If evidence to the contrary comes up, then we can look at that, okay? The thing about science, the thing about archaeology is it is a science, and it's an evidence-based science. Unlike things like physics, where if you make a mistake, you'll be jumped on by every other physicist and it gets fixed quickly, archaeology looks for rules and things, and then you find those rules get mediated by culture. And so sometimes things take a while to fix. So for example, the Piltdown Man hoax of the 1930s, where the English were looking for the missing link in the sort of hominin history, and of course the English found it. In England, of course, it's got to be true. And the guy who did the hoax was a classic archaeologist and likes jokes. And by the time he realized that there's no way that he could explain this joke without, it got far too serious, it was too late. And so you have to be careful, but it's eventually got fixed when finally a forensic anthropologist had a look at it and said, well, that's an orangutan jaw where the teeth have been filed off with a metal file, and you can see the lines that are there, so it's just met people's expectations. So we do have those sorts of things, and we have a story like that in New Zealand, which I'd like to share with you. There was a very famous bird scientist called Ron Scarlett, who worked out of Canterbury University, and he claimed to be able to identify moa bone even when it had been worked into fishhooks. And to species, which is because he was the only one around who's going to say he's wrong. But anyway, there was a dig in the South Island, and there was a famous archaeologist who was digging away, and he noticed at the morning tea break that his ginger nut biscuit looked remarkably like a highly eroded piece of moa bone. So he got out his knife and started to carve away, and it's been a lovely shank to a moa bone fishhook, and he buried it in his site and said, Ron, I found something. And Ron came up and went, oh, yes, it is a moa bone fishhook, and look, I think it's from the ginornis species, the largest moa that's around. And he said, really? And he took it and he went, no, I think it's more the Arnetii species. And at the archaeological conference only 10 years ago, they did an archaeological research project on this. They interviewed everyone who was involved, and it's true. So we like our jokes because we don't have much of a life because we're interested in archaeology, So interesting stories, but any other questions?
I think the article was read just about the rewire the Peru.
Yes. So we have a working hypothesis about what we think's going on. You know, if they were there, we would have expected them to be seen by early explorers, and we're just not seeing them. That could mean that they just weren't in the right place. But if they were as important as they were in the early historic period, they should be more widespread. So you get this circularity of argument, but you know, one day we can do genetic DNA testing to identify that, maybe in a soil that hasn't been used for 400 years. And if we find it, well, then we'll revisit it. And that's the difference between science and pure belief systems. Basically, as Bill and I come up with a theory trying to explain what was happening with the French in the 1800s and how they were influencing the whole Treaty of Waitangi and things like that, we then try and disprove what we're coming up with because we don't want our colleagues to do it. We want to make sure we've got our facts straight. And all theories and theses have a time frame, even Einstein's. So the point is we're expecting to be wrong to a degree. But if we're right, eventually we'll start moving in the right direction, as opposed to I believe something and therefore I'm going to ignore everything that doesn't match what I believe in because it's obviously wrong. So the point is that's our belief system, which is to use science as a test. But if we're wrong, I'm happy to be wrong. Ka pai. Thank you.